In the last episode of the Bizarre Yet Bonafide podcast, the names of two missing hikers were offered. I neglected to Google those names, so I was unaware that they were fairly significant until it was pointed out to me by a commenter. Sorry for the oversight. Now let's dig into this. First up is Anne Radcliffe, who was an English writer of Gothic fiction in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. She's widely considered to be one of the most important voices in the early Gothic novel tradition, and was hugely successful within her lifetime. Her fourth novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho, was widely beloved, and elevated her to the status of most read author in England, which ensured that she was able to sell her next book, The Italian, for the modern equivalent of over $100,000 American dollars. Seemingly never interested in fame or critical acclaim, she shunned the spotlight, and after writing 5 novels, retired from the small measure of public life she'd involved herself in. For the next 26 years, up until her death, she focused primarily on writing poetry, although she did also write one more novel, which her husband only published after her death. While she was extremely influential, she left so little evidence of her personal life, interviews, personal correspondence, journals, and things like that academics hoping to study her and glean some insight into how she produced such iconic texts were left stymied. For decades afterwards, it was considered basically impossible to write a biography of the woman because she'd so successfully guarded her privacy during her life. There are 3 interesting points about her work that are all worth considering when seeing her referenced in a Supermassive Games podcast. The first is that she considered herself a writer of terror rather than horror fiction. In an essay, she expounded on the difference between the two, stating that while horror focused on threats to the physical form, she was more interested in terror, which concerned threats to the mind. In a fascinating take, she felt that while horror paralyzed people's minds, terror could open them up, which makes sense because horror is all about the fear of pain and death, so your mind becomes focused on the material world, while terror is about grappling with nightmarish concepts and ideas, which you defeat by out-rationalizing them. Which brings me to the second interesting thing about her work. She was very much a rationalist. While other Gothic writers would use ghosts, demons, and curses in their works, she resolutely focused on the natural world. While her books might feature supernatural elements, there would always be a concrete, real-world explanation for them at the end, possibly making her the inspiration for Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Apparently this actually annoyed some readers at the time who felt cheated that the ghost didn't turn out to be real, which, ouch. Finally, her novels featured female protagonists who were portrayed as just as capable and able to save themselves as any male protagonist might be. One book features a main character with a love interest who not only doesn't rescue her in any meaningful way, but actually winds up losing his family fortune and becoming destitute. But it all works out because she manages to get her inheritance back from a villainous relation who attempts to steal it by imprisoning her. So we've got active, capable female leads as well. Does this mean that there's going to be a concrete, no supernatural explanation for everything in the Quarry? Probably not. What with Eliza in the backseat and all. But it's an interesting thing to take note of nonetheless. Next we have Edward Frederick Benson, who was another English writer, who lived and wrote about 100 years after Radcliffe. Before getting into his bio, I just want to share with you this amazing fact. His brother was Arthur Benson, who wrote the lyrics to Land of Hope and Glory, the piece of music that plays at North American graduation ceremonies. Neat! More relevant is his work in writing weird fiction short stories, for which he was well known and somewhat celebrated. He was referenced by H.P. Lovecraft in an essay about supernatural horror, specifically concerning the story The Man Who Went Too Far, which is an eerie tale about a man who wanders off into the woods, entranced by the sound of a flute. No one knows exactly what happens to him once he disappears, but sometime later his mangled body is found in the woods, with hoofprints leading away from it. The question is left hanging. Did he run afoul of some animal? Or was the music he heard actually being played by the pagan god Pan, who was luring him out to be some sort of sacrifice? So basically, he's the perfect person to mention in a story about people going missing or turning up dead in the woods, since that's literally what his most famous story is about. And while it isn't strictly relevant to the Quarry, that I know of, I want to mention how I'm most familiar with his work. In 1906, he wrote a story called The Bus Conductor, which is about a guy who has a nightmare about a hearse rolling up to him and the undertaker saying, "Just room for one." A month later, he's in London, and as he's about to get onto a bus, he sees that the conductor is the same man from his nightmare, who comes out of the packed bus and says, "Just room for one." The man is freaked out and doesn't get on the bus, and he's startled when, just moments after leaving the stop, the bus is smashed by a speeding truck on the cross street, doubtless killing many of the people inside. If this story sounds familiar to you, it might be because it was adapted into a short story about an elevator crash, which made it into the movie Dead of Night in 1944. And then that was adapted into a 1961 episode of The Twilight Zone, where the action was moved to an airport and becomes about a woman who refuses to get on a plane, which then explodes on takeoff. Now that Twilight Zone episode was later shamelessly ripped off by Glenn Morgan and James Wong to use as the first 20 minutes of their film, Final Destination. That's right, the E.F. Benson referenced in the BYB podcast episode inspired the Final Destination franchise. Not sure how it's going to be relevant for this game at all, but I think that's incredibly neat. I've been the Hidden Object Guru, thanks for watching. If you'd enjoyed the videos, please consider becoming a patron or buying my latest video game, Hoguru Presents The House with Too Many Zombies in It. Special thanks go out to my patrons, Marissa, Brian, Eduardo, and Joanne. If you'd like to see more from me, check out our nightly live streams or the Hidden Object Guru Plays channel. See you back here for the next thing, but until then, au revoir.